My name is Sam Wilkin. I'm Director of Political Risk Analytics at Willis Towers Watson, and today I would like to talk about the geopolitical implications of the pandemic and some associated risks and opportunities, perhaps unexpected opportunities for global trade. Now, from the beginning, the reaction to the pandemic was intensely political, and it was also intensely focused on trade. Governments began in the spring of 2020 by hoarding goods that they believed to be vital and scarce. Of course, at the time, I myself was in possession of what is in retrospect an embarrassing quantity of toilet paper, but when governments did it, it was consequential. More than 80 countries imposed restrictions on the exports of medical supplies, and then it was beginning to spread into food. Russia imposed restrictions on the exports of wheat. Things could have, a number of other countries followed suit, and things could have gotten really ugly. But fortunately, around that time, this was in late spring, we started to get some good news from Asia. A number of Asian countries had been really successful in their lockdowns and had been able to go back to work. I mean, I think it's one of the few times that I have been really glad for China being a bit authoritarian, not just because of the lockdown, but because China was able to export vital goods, including medical supplies, at a time when I think more democratic countries might have had a really hard time doing so, just as democratic countries have found it really hard to export vaccines before serving their population, their domestic population. And China has been able to do so. At the beginning of the pandemic, China was able to export vital medical goods as well as much else, while other countries were hoarding. And perhaps partly for that reason, the rest of the world gradually came to our senses. And by about this time last year, most of the restrictions on international trade had been lifted. On the other hand, China was doing a lot of other things as well. And the other major shock, I think, of 2020 was an extraordinary deterioration in China's relations with, particularly with the West, not just with the United States, of course, but also a big confrontation with the UK over Hong Kong. The EU imposed sanctions against China. There was a high altitude conflict with India. And of course, there was this incredibly bitter diplomatic dispute with Australia about the origins of the coronavirus that eventually led to suspensions of exports and tariffs targeting about 10% of Australia's exports to China. Well, that is the story of what has happened so far, but today I want to talk about what might happen next and the implications for world trade. On the left-hand side, you can see the things that I've already mentioned. Over to the right, you can see what I think will happen in the future and what will be the main issues, geopolitical issues of 2021. I want to begin with intensified geopolitical competition. Now, one aspect of this competition has been a growing reliance on sanctions. It's not the only cause of the increase in sanctions, but we had a panelist on a recent webinar on the launch of our political risk survey. We had a panelist from the Trump administration, and he talked about how the US public and the public of other countries as well are increasingly unwilling to countenance the use of force in geostrategic competition. So proxy wars, which are the main competitive element, if you will, of the Cold War, proxy wars are out and sanctions instead are in as the main way to punish countries with which the United States and other countries disagree. In fact, we've seen near doubling of sanctions in force over the past decade. And that seems likely to continue. In the U.S., for instance, the government is increasingly trying to pull out of wars in the Middle East because the public is just unwilling to tolerate deaths abroad, and so sanctions are the punitive weapon of choice. Of course, better sanctions than wars, but sanctions have a real cost for business. Now, one other thing this panelist mentioned, however, is that to his great surprise, sanctions were very effective under the Trump administration because businesses tend to over-comply. Most of the increase in sanctions is due to so-called smart sanctions. These are sanctions that are very narrow in scope. They're usually imposed against just a few people or businesses or government entities, and they really are. They're called smart because they're not intended to affect broader commerce, but companies, because they're worried about the political risk, they tend to over-comply with sanctions. For instance, uh, the sanctions against Iran that the United States imposed during the Trump administration really didn't apply to European companies, but most European companies acted as if they did apply to them because they didn't want to incur the wrath of the United States, because they were worried about the political risk. The same phenomenon has certainly been observed with sanctions on Russia, and I think now is starting to occur with sanctions on China. And that also creates an opportunity, because if your competitors are over-complying with sanctions and reacting to the perceived political risk there, admittedly it's a risk, but there are opportunities there for where you're doing businesses like with countries like China, where there are sanctions in place, but those sanctions are extremely limited. Another big geopolitical impact of the pandemic has been pandemic debt. Governments have taken on a lot of debt in dealing with the pandemic in advanced economies like the US and UK, but also in the emerging world. This incredibly confusing graph is a graph of government debt averaged across 60 countries. The dotted red line is the multi-country average. You see a few countries I've labeled there up at the top that defaulted on their debts in 2020. Now, over the course, debts were already rising in emerging markets even before the pandemic, and between uh, the beginning of the graph and 2020, the average line there is showing a near doubling in debt from about 33% of GDP to 61% of GDP in the emerging economies. And for some countries, certainly the risk will be a debt default, like we've seen in Argentina and Zambia. But for other countries, the risk is really trying to toe a very difficult line. And what I mean by that is when governments impose austerity, when they increase taxes or they reduce spending, they risk triggering social unrest as a result, right? Think of some examples: the Yellow Vest movement in France associated with fuel taxes, the huge riots that occurred in Chile, which were associated with an increase in subway fares. Governments aren't necessarily being irresponsible when they avoid dealing with debt. They're trying to walk a tightrope between the risk of default on one side and the risk of triggering mass protests against austerity as a result. And so the implication of this is, I think we will see in countries that have a lot of pandemic debt, potentially we will see more widespread debt crisis, but I certainly hope that doesn't happen. I think what we will see is a lot of individualized crises in countries that are struggling with a hugely increased debt burden. Probably the biggest example of this since the pandemic has been Colombia, where the government recently tried to impose a fiscal reform and triggered a wave of mass unrest that is, as I speak, continuing. Now, of course, there are opportunities in boom and bust cycles. One investor presentation that I recently saw, an investor said that he never invests in an emerging market country unless there are tanks in the streets. It's the old sort of buy low, sell high adage. Another investor that I knew who eventually became a billionaire, he said that he was a value investor, but in fact what he had done was he had bought a lot of things right at the bottom, buying some large South Korean companies right during the Asian financial crisis, buying countries in Hong Kong right during the handover. He had a knack for timing as well as value. Now, you may wonder to yourself, well, I'm not a financial markets investor. How does it apply to me? Well, let me give you an example that I stumbled across while visiting the Guinness Brewery in Dublin. To my great surprise, some of the top markets for Guinness are reliably in Africa. Now, this is by volume, but in many years, if you give it a Google, you'll find that these markets are also among the top markets for Guinness by sales as well. And what's happening there? Well, certainly Guinness and Nigeria could warrant a business school case study. They've done a lot of things right, but one thing they have done is they have invested during downturns. The Nigerian economy tends to be hugely cyclical because it's dependent on oil prices. And so when oil prices are down, the economy goes into a bust. When oil prices rise, the economy booms. And so what the managers of Guinness brand would do would be they would pick up market share when there was a bust. And of course, at that time, that market share, that sales volume wasn't worth very much. But as the economy recovered and as the currency recovered and as the prices recovered, then that market share started to be worth quite a lot. Now, obviously, this kind of strategy of exploiting boom and bust cycles is really powerful if you face domestic competitors in emerging markets. But it can be powerful even against other international competitors because it's often really hard to convince your management to invest in developing market share in a country at a time when the country is in the midst of a crisis. So the pandemic debt situation and the boom and bust cycles that are likely to result can present a lot of opportunity as well as some pretty self-evident risks. You want to avoid, of course, the Argentina case, where in Argentina really hasn't successfully recovered from the last debt crisis that occurred more a couple of decades ago now. Last thing I want to mention, rising economic nationalism, and this actually goes back to the topic of intensified geopolitical competition, but this is competition among, well, allies as well as strategic competitors. So one characteristic of the recovery from the pandemic has been the focus on industrial policy, the resurgence of industrial policy, both in the European Union's next generation EU package, in China, a lot of different packages. Most famous of them, I think, is Made in China 2025. The UK, it's a little bit more ambiguous. There's been a bit of a squabble over industrial policy recently, but countries are really focusing on developing national champions in industries considered to be strategic. And that's been a focus of pandemic recovery packages around the world. Now, the downside of this is what you might call the aerospacification of everything. In other words, if you think about the aerospace sector, which has been strategic for a very long time and has been subject to extensive government intervention and subsidies for a very long time, the aerospace sector has triggered tremendous trade wars between the US and Europe, including the UK. And these trade wars, I think the aerospace trade war has gone on for about 17 years. It's involved more than $100 million, well over $100 million in legal costs. If I were an international lawyer, I would be looking at this situation and I would be spelling money. And it's also involved in, I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it, it's involved in US companies, for instance, paying more than $1 billion in tariffs as the US and Europe have challenged each other at the World Trade Organization. So there will be certainly downsides to this aerospacification of more sectors, but there are upsides. One upside is an increase in government support. And there's quite a lot of government support to go around right now. In the United States, we've seen government spending as a share of economic output increase by nearly a fifth during the pandemic. The increase in the UK hasn't been quite so large, but the UK government is particularly motivated because the UK government really wants Brexit to seem like a success. I said I wouldn't mention Brexit, but there I go, mentioning Brexit. So this increase in government spending is certainly going to lead to a lot of support. I think that's the subject of some of the other panels, is getting a hold of that support. I think there's one other lesson from the aerospacification of everything. Get your lobbyists ready, but there's one other lesson, which is also from the aerospace sector, is you may have recently read there has been a truce in the aerospace trade war between the US and Europe. And the reason, one of the major reasons for that truce, is the US and Europe seeing that the real threat in aerospace is coming from China. So they really have to stop fighting each other. And so I think this is a trend that can be a real upside, especially if your competitors are from China, to a lesser extent from Europe, but especially if your competitors are from China. Of course, there are certainly risks as well. So what I've covered today here is certainly risks, but also opportunities resulting from potential overcompliance with sanctions and avoiding that, from taking advantage of boom-bust cycles in emerging markets, and from the increase in government support schemes in a world of aerospacification from sectors, for lack of a better word. Of course, there are risks that come along with each of these trends as well, but that is a subject for the next panel.